Thank you all for having me. It's good to be with you. I was literally just about to get on a plane uh, a year ago last March to go speak in London and then over to Ireland and speak in Ireland. And the very next day, they shut down international travel. And so it was good I didn't go because I would have been stuck in limbo for probably a couple of weeks getting home. But uh, I'm glad that things are starting to open up a little bit again, and maybe I'll get to come and meet in person sometime as well. Just to cut right to the chase, and then I'll back up and tell you a bit more about me. Sometimes during my 25-year career in the emergency department, uh, I would see people pass away, and this would happen not on a daily basis, but at least once a week. I'd be with somebody when they transitioned. And sometimes when that happened, I'd literally see their souls leave their bodies and they'd communicate with me before they left. And as Chuck said, it started for me when I was a child. I didn't realize this was such a big deal or such an unusual thing until I started to talk about my experiences. I didn't talk about any of this for the 25 years I was practicing in the emergency department. It just didn't feel right to talk about it. I think there was some concern that it might jeopardize my professional career and my academic standing. I think at times I just felt that some of the experiences were a little too sacred to talk about. And then when I stopped seeing patients in the emergency department a few months later, I woke up and something just clicked in my soul, and somehow I knew it was okay to talk about it. And that's when I started to share some of my experiences. And people would come up to me and they'd ask me when this started and how this happened and why I had these experiences, and I didn't have any answers for them. I thought about it a lot because I didn't have an answer to their question. Then I started to think back about it, and I think it all started when I was a month before my 12th birthday when my brother died in a farm accident. He tipped a tractor over, and we were really close. We were just kids, but you know, my older brother gave me my first chew of tobacco one day when I was riding on the back of the horse with him. We were riding double on the horse, and I started chewing on this wad of Copenhagen, and I got so sick I almost fell off the back of the horse. He gave me my first beer. We did a lot of things that we never told our mother about, and so I was really close to my brother. I believed every word he ever told me until one day he tried to tell me about sex. And I said, no way. And he goes, yeah, really. So when my brother was suddenly gone, it impacted me deeply. I didn't realize that it impacted me so deeply. In fact, although I saw the suffering and horror of my parents having their firstborn child pass away, I thought it didn't really impact me until about 20 years later when my brother came to me. And when I say came to me, I mean, I saw him, and people say, well, how did you see him? And I don't know how to explain that because I didn't see it with my natural eyes. It felt like I was looking through my eyes, but if I saw these souls with my physical eyes, then other people would see them at the same time, I suppose. So I'm not certain how that happens, but I saw him, and he spoke to me, and he said, you need to go talk with our mother because there's things she's never told you about my death. And as you can imagine, that kind of got my attention. So I went and I had a visit with my mother, and she told me that day for the very first time that she said, I always knew where you were in the house before Stan died because I could hear you singing. When your brother died, you stopped singing. So I guess my brother's departure had a deeper impact on me than I really realized. And it was shortly after that that I started getting these messages, usually messages coming in the form of a voice speaking to me, sometimes feelings or impressions or just some inexplicable knowing, but often it was a voice speaking to me in sentences. Um, and when I was 16 years old, a few years after my brother's death, I was driving a Volkswagen Bug much too fast after dark on a narrow, windy country road, because I grew up in rural Utah, hauling hay and occasionally milking the neighbors' cows. Fortunately, we didn't have any cows of our own. But I was driving this car. I had friends with me. None of us were wearing seatbelts back then. And we were probably going just about as fast as that car would go. And a voice spoke to me and said, "You have to slow down." And I did. The voice wrapped itself around my soul, and I listened. And I don't even know why, because I was in such a rebellious time in my life. I was mad about my brother being gone. I wouldn't have listened to my parents if they were speaking to me. I wouldn't have listened to law enforcement. I've joked that if God had been sitting in the seat next to me, I wouldn't have listened. But that voice somehow compelled me, and I slowed down. I went around the corner. I hit a Cadillac head on. There was a lot of damage, but nobody was injured. I think I might have died that night if I hadn't listened to that voice. And I later came to believe that that voice was my brother, because that is the only voice that I would have listened to. I always listened to him. And so as I grew through the years, the experiences became more distinct. And even what I didn't recognize at the time, I later, looking back, realized, oh, that's what was going on. That's who that was speaking to me. And by the time I got to the emergency department after my medical school training, I'd had enough experiences that they were comfortable for me, and I wouldn't just hear the message. Sometimes I'd see the messenger. And so when I'd see people leave their souls in the ER, it was a beautiful, wonderful, powerful experience, but it wasn't earth-shattering for me. It wasn't something that was so out of the ordinary for me that it changed me in a deep way, because it just happened naturally over many years. So one day I'm in the ER working. I'd been a doc for a number of years at that point in time. There was one person in the ER that knew I had these experiences, and she was a nurse. And she was one of these outgoing nurses that talked to me a lot more than I was comfortable talking, because I was pretty introverted. I didn't talk about things, but she kind of forced the issue, and she'd talk to me, and she came to my home even and visited with me. And she started to tell me about some of her experiences, and they were these profound spiritual experiences that made me weep. And she pried out of me that, yes, I sometimes saw these things and had these experiences. She was the only person in the ER that knew I'd had these experiences, and she'd had them too. So late one evening, I'm working in the ER, and it was a level 1 trauma center. That's the highest level you can get. So we saw the very sickest patients, and we saw the worst injured trauma people that were flown in from not only our state, but other neighboring states to our facility. And this nurse came and tapped me on the arm one day, started pulling on my arm, said, "You have to come to the trauma room." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because she's there." He said, "Who's there? What are you talking about?" She said, his wife. "She's there. You have to come." Well, I knew it dawned on me what she was talking about, because in a trauma center, when you're taking transfers like that, you get phone calls and radio communications and other things. So you're not surprised when you get a major trauma patient that comes flown in from out of town or out of state, because you got to get all this information. I knew that we had this inbound trauma patient coming, but there was other doctors there, and they were going to take care of it. They'd signed up to take care of it, and I wasn't going to be involved. So what happened was this man, his name was Jeff Olson, and he shared his story widely now. He's written a book about it, so I'm not sharing anything that's private. Um, he had been in a car crash a couple hundred miles south of Salt Lake City in rural Utah. He had fallen asleep at the wheel, he thinks. He doesn't know for sure because he can't remember, but he'd lost control of the car, it rolled over. It instantly took the life of his wife of 10 years, Tamra, and his 14-month-old son, Griffin. They were taken instantly. And he was trapped in the car and badly injured himself. He had a 7-year-old son in the back seat who was minimally injured. And when Jeff Olson, when the car finally came to a stop, he could hear Spencer, his 7-year-old, in the back seat crying. And that's when he realized nobody else was making any sounds, and he knew that half of his family was gone. Well, they extricated him from the vehicle, took him to a local hospital. They stabilized him the best they could, and then they put him in a plane and flew him to my hospital. And that's who this nurse was talking about when she said, "You have to come to the trauma room." So I knew that he had a deceased wife at the scene and a deceased son at the scene, because that was part of the accident report. And when I went down to the trauma room, I walked into the trauma room. Jeff Olson was laying motionless on the gurney. There was a crowd of providers, other physicians, nurses, and others taking care of him. And standing above him in the air was his deceased wife, Tamra. And she communicated with me. For me, it was as if everything in the room got quiet. It's like somebody turned down the volume on the TV. Everybody else kept doing their jobs. They were all talking to each other, but for me, the room was quiet. And the only thing I experienced was Tamra's presence. And she expressed her profound gratitude for the care that her husband was receiving. And it was like time slowed down, and things just changed into a different realm for me. I walked over to the gurney. I looked down at his legs. One of his legs was really badly injured. I checked the pulse in his foot, and I remember thinking or saying out loud, "Oh, he's going to lose the leg." I just knew that. I had a pretty good idea of it medically, but somehow spiritually or cosmically, I knew it. And although he was horribly injured, had chest trauma and abdominal trauma, and I knew that he'd live. And somehow in the midst of all this, I knew that he and I would have a shared future together, that there was something about the future of both our lives that we'd share. And I knew all this in an instant. And as I looked down at Jeff, I could still see Tamra standing behind me in the air, because I could see in all directions at the same time. And although she had a seemingly tangible form or essence about her, I could see what was beyond her on the other side of where she was. It wasn't like I could see through her, like she was translucent, like you see depicted in film. There was substance there, but it was as if it didn't preclude me from seeing what was beyond. My sight, if you will, was perfected. And people ask me how this is so. From a medical perspective, this is how sight works. Okay, this is a doctor speaking now for a minute. You have electromagnetic waves traveling through the air, and they go through your cornea and your lens, and they're focused on the retina of your eye. And the rods and cones in the retina convert those electromagnetic waves into electrical signals that travel down your optic nerve. And they cross over at what's called the chiasm and go to the opposite side of your brain, where they're received by the occipital cortex, and an image is formed. That's how sight works from a medical perspective. When I see things spiritually, it's as if all of those physical steps are bypassed, and I just get the perfected, pure, unadulterated image. And I don't know why everybody standing next to me doesn't get it as well. I can't explain that. But the nurse, in my book, I call the nurse Rachel. she saw it too. She experienced Jeff's wife's presence as well. Well, we took care of Jeff. We sent him off to the OR. I took off my shoe covers and my trauma gown and walked back out into the department and finished my shift and went home. I wrote one sentence about it in my journal, and I never expected to see this guy again, this stranger. But then a month later, this same nurse came and started tugging on my arm again. And I was like, go away. I don't like it when you tug on my arm. Leave me alone. She goes, we have to go tell Jeff what happened, because this guy's name was Jeff as well. And I said, no, we don't. She goes, yeah, we need to tell him that we saw his wife. I said, listen, if you want to go tell your most spiritual experiences, you be my guest, but I don't need to do it. But she prevailed. She was a good nurse. Good nurses always prevail upon doctors to do the right thing. And she dragged me kicking and screaming up to Jeff's hospital room, where she proceeded to pull up a chair and sit next to his bed and tell him about this experience we'd had, because she saw Tamara as well. And I'm pretty closed mouth sort of guy, especially back then. I wasn't talking about any of this stuff. And I didn't remember this, but Jeff told me 20 years later, he said, yeah, you kind of stood against the wall, leaned against the wall and didn't say much. And I thought, that sounds like an accurate recollection. Yeah, that's probably me. And so she proceeded to tell him what we'd experienced in the trauma room. And as she did, Jeff started to weep. He got emotional. And I didn't understand why initially. He explained to me years later that it was because we were there and we were medical health professionals talking to him about this profound spiritual experience that he felt empowered, like he could share his own experience. And he proceeded to tell us that before his body was even extricated from the vehicle, he'd left his physical form and he'd risen up above the scene of the accident, and in an indescribable light, he'd met his deceased wife, and she said, you have to go back and raise our other son, because the 7-year-old was still alive in the car. And so Jeff re-entered his body, and he shared that with us that very first day we ever spoke. I just spoke to IANDS last month, the international conference, and my topic that I talked about was normalizing shared death experiences among healthcare providers. And the reason I chose that topic is because I have physicians and nurses around the world who have had experiences not too dissimilar from mine, and most of them never talk about their experiences. And consequently, most patients who have a near-death experience never get to talk with somebody that understands what they're going through. Their doctors don't want to talk about it. The doctors, for fear of many things, including professional being ostracized, they're reluctant to talk about their own experiences. But this happens a lot. And the way we normalize it is we start to talk about it. And I shared this experience with Jeff Olson in that talk last month, because it's a perfect example of how somebody who had this profound near-death experience, which, by the way, he later wrote in a book, and you can buy it and read it anytime you want. In fact, I thought about calling and asking him if he wanted to join me today, but he was doing something else. Because healthcare providers were comfortable talking to him about their experience, he spoke about his years earlier than the average near-death experiencer. On average, they don't speak about it for about 7 years. And Jeff didn't talk to many people about it, but he told me about it that very first day. And when I went to see him for the first time outside the hospital, I went to his brother's home. He was too sick to go to his own home. He was at his brother's home for a while. They had to take off his leg. He had bad chest trauma and bad abdominal injuries, and he needed help and care. I went to see him, and we had a profound experience. He told me in great detail about the things he would write about years later. And he saw me in boots, cowboy boots and blue jeans, and I had on a belt buckle of a bull rider in a rodeo. And when he saw me dressed that way, he thought, oh, maybe I can trust this guy. I didn't know that until he told me many years later. So as it turned out, Jeff and I had grown up in neighboring counties in rural Utah, and we'd both played football. We'd probably been on the football field at the same time at some point in our high school careers. And he rode bareback broncs in rodeos, and I rode bulls. So I tease him about that a lot. And I had a lot of those kind of experiences in the emergency department. I came one day to work, normal day. I start to log on to my computer. And as I'm doing stuff, I'm aware of a presence over my shoulder. I knew intuitively who it was. It was the soul of the person around the corner in the resuscitation bay that a physician and a team of providers were trying to bring to resuscitate. She was unconscious. She had no heartbeat. She was intubated. They were ventilating her with a bag valve mask through an endotracheal tube. And it was her soul standing over my shoulder asking me for help. So I stopped what I was doing and I walked around the corner and into the resuscitation bay. Nobody paid any attention to me at all. I'd worked in the emergency department for years. As Chuck said, I was the department chair for 8 years. I was wearing scrubs and probably a white coat, and it wasn't uncommon for some other physician to come into a room when you have a critically ill patient like that to see if any help's needed. So nobody paid any attention to me. I looked at the gurney. I saw the woman unconscious on the gurney, and there was one empty spot around the gurney. Everybody was crowded around trying to take care of her. There was one empty spot. I just kind of casually walked over and rested my leg on her, or rested my hand on her leg, because I'd learned that touch is so important in these experiences. And as I touched her leg, she asked me if she could leave. This is telepathic, mind you. This is soul to soul. She's unconscious. She's got a tube in her throat. She can't talk. Nobody else in the room's aware of what's going on, and she's asking me if she can leave. And my first thought was, why in the world would you ask me? Why would you think I have any control or any knowledge about your eternal spiritual destiny? Why would you ask me if you can leave? But that's not what came out. Instead, what came into my mind and what I communicated back to her silently, telepathically, if you will, the words were given to me from some divine place. And I told her, I said, if you think it's time to go and you feel that's the right thing to do, I think it's probably okay for you to do it. It was as if somehow she just needed somebody to validate her and where she was going and that it was the right time. I didn't have any control over it. I had absolutely no responsibility for her medical care. The doctor that was taking care of her kept giving orders. Everybody else kept doing what they were doing. I was just standing there silently in the room, touching her leg. And as I said, I think it's okay for you to go, she rose up out of her body and she stood in the air above the gurney. She appeared to be about half the age of the body that she'd just come out of. She still had this physical form about her, it seemed. At least she had the shape and size of her physical form, but in a perfected state, if you will. And she was filled with light and glory and knowledge. And she filled me with those things as I looked at her. And she smiled and thanked me profusely. And then she left. And I thought, what are you thanking me for? I didn't do anything. But when I've had these experiences, the common thread, one of the common things that I experience is that they are always profoundly grateful. And she left. I turned around, I walked out of the room. As I'm leaving the room, I hear the physician in charge in military time pronounce her time of death. And I thought to myself, yeah, I know, I saw her leave. And I went out and I logged onto my computer, and that's how my day began. So I had a lot of these kind of experiences in the emergency department. And one of the things that I came to believe or understand was that uh, souls, if that's what we want to call them, our soul, our consciousness, our essence, our divine being, our higher self, whatever terminology works for you, don't let my words get in the way of understanding this. Just substitute my words or phrases with whatever's comfortable for you. What I came to understand was that our souls have existed for eons, eternities. And in fact, I had these similar kind of experiences when people were born, because I witnessed a lot of births as well. And the way I think of it is, imagine yourself as if you were in a room, and it's just kind of a little bit gray. It's not dark, but it's not really bright either. It's just kind of this gray shades, and there's a bunch of people in the room with you, and you're wandering around mingling in this huge room, and on one side of the room is this heavy, thick curtain, if you will, and beyond the curtain is this brilliant, bright, white light, this glorious realm, if you will, beyond the curtain. And on the other side of the room, there's another curtain just like it, and the same thing is beyond that curtain, this brilliant, glorious realm. And every once in a while, somebody on the left side of the room draws back the curtain and a soul enters the room. That's birth. And every once in a while on the other side of the room, somebody draws back the curtain and a soul leaves. And that's death. And if you happen to be standing close to the curtain when it's drawn back, if you happen to be in spiritual proximity, if you will, maybe you get to see into that other realm a little bit. Maybe if the curtain's drawn open wide enough or held open long enough, you get to see somebody you know on the other side. And that's kind of the way I imagine what happens at birth and death. And the curtain is this physical body. You're entering into this room, and as the room, the veil, the curtain of your physical form closes, slams shut around you, that's birth. And you walk around for a period of time, kind of unaware for the most part of what's on the other side of the curtain, until eventually you get to walk through that curtain back into that realm. That's how things felt for me when I was in the emergency department, experiencing people coming from another realm through birth and being in their physical form and then departing their physical form at death and being back into that realm of light and glory and knowledge. And so that's how I think about us and life. And as Chuck said, I didn't really think a lot about this for a long time or talk about it. And then after I started talking about it with a few trusted friends, 6 months later, I'd written my book. And I got a phone call from Raymond Moody. And I'd never spoken to him before. And Raymond said, "Jeff, for 40 years, I've been a skeptical, objective, scientific observer of near-death experiences, and I never really believed that there was life after death, notwithstanding the title of his book and all the things he studied and talked about for these decades. He was a non-believer." And he said, "After I heard about your experience with Jeff Olson and I read your book, I relinquished my doubts, and I now believe that there is life after death." So I thought, well, that's pretty good coming from Raymond Moody. I didn't know much about Raymond at the time. I didn't know him at all when I first started talking about stuff, and then people started telling me about Raymond Moody. Since then, I've become friends with Bruce Greyson. If you're not familiar with Bruce Greyson, you might check out his book titled After. Bruce Greyson's a psychiatrist, now emeritus at University of Virginia. He's been studying near-death experiences for 50 years. He's published, I don't know, well over 100 peer-reviewed articles, and this is his first attempt to really write for the non-medical reader. And his book After is a great read about near-death experiences, what we know, what we don't know, and some postulation about what might be going on. I've become good friends with Mary Neal, who was the head of spine surgery at USC for a time. She had her near-death experience when she was trapped for 30 minutes underwater on a kayaking trip. And so she came back with a list of things that she was going to do or experience. And sadly, one of the things on her list was that she would experience the death of her son, which happened about 10 years later. And I'm friends with Eben Alexander, Harvard-trained neurosurgeon, absolute materialist. He believed that consciousness existed because of the brain. The brain created consciousness. Then he had a rare form of bacterial meningitis and was in a coma for a week or so, and much longer than that recovering from it. When he'd recovered enough from his coma to read his own medical record, he concluded that his brain was far too sick to have created what he'd experienced. Mind you, he's a neurosurgeon. He concluded that consciousness exists in spite of the brain, not because of it. That in fact, the brain acts as a filter to allow us to live in this realm. Very much as similar to what I just described earlier about the room, living in the room with the curtains on either side. Our body is our filter. It is our brain. The rest of our physical form is our filter. It's our veil. It's that curtain that filters things that enable us to function in this realm. Because as Bruce Greyson described it, if we didn't have a filter, if we sensed everything that was going on around us in the other realms, it would be like trying to watch TV with all the different channels all turned on at the same time, trying to discern, trying to pay attention to one thing when all the other things are going around you at the same time. So there's a reason that we don't experience the spiritual or the other realms all the time. We're here to learn things. We're here to experience things. And some of that has to be subdued for a time to allow us to accomplish what we're here to accomplish. And I'm convinced that what we're here to accomplish is very simple. My friend Jeff Olson, the one that was flown in to my trauma center that night, when he was out of his body for an extended period of time, and that's an ironic word to use because time doesn't exist in that realm, but he came into the presence of a divine being. Still to this day, he's reluctant to articulate his feelings about who that divine being was. But anyway, he came into the presence of this divine being. And he was really troubled by all the things that he thought he'd done wrong in this life. Sometimes the things that he thought he knew were wrong, but he'd done them anyway. And that really bothered him. And he started to wonder if he could ever be forgiven for these things that he'd done. And this divine being spoke to him and said, "There's nothing to forgive. We don't view things that way here." And he was asked one question in his life review, if you will. His one question that he was asked was, "To what extent did you learn to love?" That was the only thing. And if you've read other people's near-death experiences, most of them have a similar takeaway message, a similar experience. In fact, one of my friends is an emergency nurse up in Pennsylvania. Here's another great example of why it's important for healthcare providers to start talking about their own experiences. She was in the emergency department. They brought in a patient who was in full cardiac arrest, having a heart attack, and they were actively trying to resuscitate him. They were doing chest compressions on him. And she looked up across the room and saw him standing in the corner across the room, observing his own resuscitation. They successfully crammed his soul back into his physical body. And when he got a heartbeat back, they sent him upstairs to the ICU. And a few days later, she went up to visit him. And he was awake by then and able to talk. And he proceeded to tell her about how when he was out of his body, he also encountered a divine being. And he was certain that the divine being he encountered was Christ. He had grown up in a very strict Christian tradition. He was Catholic. He was a German of German extraction. He was very by the book, very much by the rules, a very black and white person, both in his innate nature, he was that way, and also in his religious tradition, he was that way. Some would say pedantic. So when he was out of his body and he met this being that he said was Christ, he started to explain himself that way. He said, I read the books. I did everything I was told to do. I kept all the rules. I followed all the rules. And this being that he said was Christ looked at him and said, it wasn't about the rules. It was about love. And then he sent this man back and said, go back and tell everybody about this experience and share this message whenever you can. And so my friend said that they became friends. He lived several more years after that. And whenever she saw him, he reiterated his experience and the message he'd received when he was out of his body. So we want to make things complex and complicated, and in reality, they're very simple. It's all about love, learning to love. And so I continue to have experiences. My brother came to me again just a few years ago. It'd been 45 years since he died. And he came to me when I was in meditation. And he touched my hand. And when he touched my hand, everything faded away. The room that I was in was gone. And I was in some glorious, brilliant, bright place. And he took me by the hand and he led me around this place that I think a lot of people would describe as heaven. And as he did so, he showed me my life in review. He showed me the most significant days of my life when my trajectory had changed course significantly in one way or another. And he showed me how it was him that had intervened on my behalf on those days. And I came to understand, not just from that experience, but from many others, that when people leave this realm, they may have a lot of other things going on, but they also are aware of us. And they intervene for us sometimes. They come and they help us. Sometimes we're aware, and most of the time we're probably not aware. But they still care about us. Loved ones are still loved ones, I learned. And he showed me that day, when he was showing me all of these things, he showed me the day he died. I'd always experienced it as a 12-year-old boy. It happened just a month before my 12th birthday. And I'd seen the agony of my parents. I still have in my mind the scream of my mother when her family came to the house and told her that her firstborn son was gone. It's like tattooed in my brain. And my father, an ecclesiastical leader, went and picked up my father from work. He was working about 20 miles away. and brought him home. And I saw my father come into the house, and he turned the corner into the living room. He saw my mother sitting on the couch, and he went over and he sat down on my mother's lap, and he buried his face in her, on her shoulder, and he just wept. It's the first time I'd ever seen my father cry. I didn't know this until just a few years ago. All these years since my brother's death, I hadn't known this. My brother wanted a new pair of cowboy boots that summer, and he went to my dad and said, I want a new pair of cowboy boots. And they were like $125, which was a lot of money back then. And my dad said, I can't afford that. And my brother said, it's okay, you don't have to buy them. I got a job on the other end of the county. So he was working on a ranch at the other end of the county. He wasn't working at home when he tipped the tractor over. He was earning money. And when my father came back from lunch, he walked into his office, and here's this ecclesiastical leader sitting in his office. It's like getting a phone call from the highway patrol at 3 a.m. I'm sure my father's heart just sunk. This man looked at him and said, there's been an accident. Stan's injured. And my father looked at him and said, how bad is it? And this man looked at him and said, he's dead. Now, I know what it feels like to say that, because I had to say that so many times over my career. It was the worst part of being an emergency physician, was trying to figure out, how do you tell a loved one that their family member or their friend has passed? And the thing is everybody wants to be told in a different way. There's no way you can just standardize it. You just have to try and be connected enough to know what to say and how to say it, and so, to be compassionate. So this man looked up at my father and he said, he's dead. And first thing my father said was, my son's dead for a pair of cowboy boots. He'd been carrying that guilt all those years. So my brother showed me this day that he died when he came to me a few years ago, and he showed me the day he died. He showed it to me from the perspective of my parents. And I experienced the horrible agony of my parents losing their firstborn son, the loneliness, the pain, the sorrow, the sadness, everything. I experienced it. And in the midst of experiencing all of that from their perspective, my brother looked at me and he said, go tell our parents not to be sad anymore. Tell them I'm okay, and I want them to be happy when they talk about me. It had been 45 years since he died. I had still never seen my parents talk about my brother Stan in any except the very most superficial of ways, when they didn't get emotional, when they didn't get tearful. And so it took me a while to work up the courage to go have that conversation with my parents. Fortunately, my book had been published by then. When my book was published, my parents both asked me, they said, how come we didn't know any of these things about you? When they read my book, because I just didn't talk about it. They knew I had some of these kind of experiences now, because they'd read my book. And so it still took me a few weeks to work up the courage to go sit and talk with them. And I told them about this recent encounter I'd had with Stan, when he told me that he was okay, and that he wanted me to tell them to be happy when they talked about him and not to be sad anymore. And it was that day that my father told me about the boots. That was the first time I'd ever heard about the boots. Ironically, they went and bought those boots. My brother was buried in those boots. But that was the first day I'd ever heard about them. And as my father told me the experience, my brother explained to me, this is why I've sent you here. I knew he would tell you this. Tell him not to feel guilty anymore. That was the real message for my father. And I got to tell him that. Not to feel guilty anymore. So when we think about our loved ones, I think about, I'm still inhibited. I'm still constrained in many regards by my medical training and my scientific mind and my left brain thinking. I still have a hard time getting out of myself sometimes to experience the spiritual, because when I look at things, I see them very physical and very literal sometimes. When I hear people talking about elevating your vibration, I'm going, it's a figure of speech. From a physics perspective, so many things that people say, many of the words they say are more figurative. They're metaphors, and my physical mind, my literal thinking gets in the way sometimes. But the way I view it is, I went to medical school, I learned how to take care of the physical body. And that's what I did as a physician. But none of that precluded me from knowing that there was something in addition. In addition to the physical, there was a spiritual, if you will. There was this essence, this light, or this presence that constitutes our higher self, this consciousness. And for me, the spiritual were always complementary. People thought I had a conflict having all these spiritual experiences as a physician. I said, no, it wasn't a contradiction. It wasn't a conflict for me. It was always complementary. They went together. I experienced them together as one. Sometimes I knew things that I couldn't know physically. I had a patient come in one time after a motorcycle accident. He was a young guy. A car had stopped in front of him in town. He'd laid his bike on its side and slid across the road and kind of bumped into the curb. No big deal. He was wearing a helmet and full protective gear. He didn't think himself to be injured. But the EMTs dutifully strapped him to a board, put him in a cervical collar, and drug him to the emergency department. And he wanted me to let him get up and go home. There's some very specific, well-defined, published criteria, evidence-based criteria, to decide whether somebody needs an x-ray of their head or neck. And I went through those criteria. He didn't meet any of those criteria. I was about to take off his collar and let him get up and walk home, or walk away, go home. And I just had this knowing somehow that I was about to make a horrible mistake. And I talked with this patient about it. I said, listen, you don't meet any medical criteria for me to scan your head, but I just feel like we should do it. And I don't have an explanation why. And I won't do it if you don't want me to, but I think we should. And he joked about it. He said, go ahead, doc, order the unnecessary test so I can get up and get out of here. So I ordered the CT scan. Normally I'd get results back via the computer, 30, 45 minutes later. On this occasion, they wheeled him down to CT and I got a phone call immediately from the radiologist. He was collecting arterial blood in his skull, compressing his brain. It was happening so rapidly that the radiologist could see swirls in the images, swirls of blood in the images. He had what was called an epidural hematoma. When I went back down to his room to see him, he was getting drowsy. And because I worked in a level 1 trauma center, I made one phone call and the neurosurgeon had him in the OR 15 or 20 minutes later, draining that blood out of his head, which sounds like a horrible thing, but he was probably healed and back on his motorcycle within a couple of weeks. If I'd have let him get up and walk out of my emergency department, he would have almost certainly died that night. I can't explain how I knew that he needed that scan. I like to think that something in his higher self or consciousness knew what was going on and communicated to my higher self or my consciousness and told me something that science couldn't. And so I have a healthy respect both for science and for spirit. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Spiritual things don't become scientific or mundane just because we begin to understand them. For example, I like to study history. I study a lot of history. On one account I read about in the mid-1800s, these guys went to what was then called the Sandwich Islands, now Hawaii, and they dropped anchor in Lahaina Harbor, and they had to get on a smaller vessel to go ashore back then. And the seas were a little bit rough. And one of the younger men that was with them had been there before. And he told them, don't get in that landing craft because the sea's too rough. You'll capsize. And they chided him for being afraid and pressed him a bit about it. And he finally told him, he said, listen, if you get in that boat, it's going to capsize. So I'm not getting in unless you tell me I have to. I'm staying here. So they laughed at him. They got in the boat. The older men got in the boat. They're rowing ashore. Sure enough, the boat capsizes in the rough seas. One of the men drowns. They pulled his lifeless body out of the surf, and he was laying there motionless, unconscious on the sand. And one of the men that was witnessing this had this impression come into their mind, said, put your mouth on his and blow air into his lungs, which he did, and he resuscitated this man. So I did a little research. Mouth-to-mouth resuscitation had been described in a few of the major academic medical centers in Europe at that time. It was not common knowledge. It was not common practice. And for this man standing on the beach in Hawaii, it was a completely spiritual experience. Now we hear about it all the time. We don't even think about it. It's just science. Yeah, of course, to put air in their lungs, they're going to, yeah. And this is my point. Just because we start to understand the science doesn't negate the spiritual nature of things. It didn't stop being spiritual just because it became scientific. And I could give you several more examples. Most notably, perhaps, is the proliferation of cardiac defibrillators in public places now. You know, you see these automatic defibrillators on the walls in the airport, in the casinos in Las Vegas, on the airplanes, every place, and people are being resuscitated. All those people, virtually all of those people died 30 or 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Now, many of them are being resuscitated. And according to Pim van Lommel's work, he's a cardiologist in the Netherlands. He actually studied this and published his results in the JAMA, or not JAMA, in the Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals in the world. 18% of those people that are resuscitated from a cardiac arrest have a near-death experience. 1 out of 5. And we're resuscitating hundreds of thousands of people from cardiac arrests every year now because we have defibrillators. So it's still spiritual, even though it's now scientific, even though we now understand some of the physics behind it, it's still a profoundly spiritual thing. And we need to recognize that among our patients, among our coworkers, or among our loved ones. If you have a loved one who has experienced major life-threatening trauma and ends up in an ICU, their chance of having a near-death experience is almost 30%. So I love that IANDS is making an effort to educate people, to talk about it, to normalize it,